Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день.
Afternoon, colleagues. I apologize for being that late. Unfortunately, we had some force majeure beyond our control. We will try to make up for the time spent waiting by the high-quality debates, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. Today they will talk G20, and not only that, also global governance and other issues. Most importantly, I'd like to say that we are having today Svetlana Lukash, who is G20 veteran and other institutions veteran. She used to work with the G8 when we participated. She is our Sherpa in G20, deputy head of the Presidential Experts Directorate of the Russian Federation, Mr. Murat Berdiyev, co-Sherpa, who has been doing a lot in G20 in the area of trade policies. He's to share his thoughts with us and his ideas. Today we're also attending Madam Natalia Volchkova, Martin Gilman, professor from the National Research University High School of Economics, Zia Qureshi, visiting research fellow of the Brookings Institution, Gabriel Dibella, IMF representative in the Russian Federation, Andras Hovai, country director and resident representative of the World Bank for the Russian Federation, Europe and Central Asia, Shilakov Denis, first Vice President Gazprom Bank, and Georgy Tolerai, Executive Director, Russian National Committee on Brics, Research Director of Regional Programs Department of the Ruski Mir Foundation, East Asia Section Director at the Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So we have an extensive agenda, including G20 and beyond. So we have made mention of G20 today in relation with the risks it helped cope 10 years ago, but there are some new risks and challenges that G20 should be addressing and tackling, like the growth in protectionism and sanctions and their exterritorial application, declining to comply with the multilateral obligations, digital disruption, and income gap and other issues. Some of people in this room are quite skeptical about G20's capability and potential, and some people say that G20 is going through a crisis, an identity crisis, and that it is said G20 is not able to regain political will to resolve many of the political and economic issues, and in the past it coped with the regulation issues. It increased threefold the funding of the IMF, and it modified the capital markets, and G20 helped coordinate taxation measures in 2013, and a great deal of employment decisions were made. And thanks to those, probably we have been able to make employment issues much less acute. And there were projections, grim projections, about the growth of unemployment by 2010. We've been able to get to grips with those. To a certain extent, G20 was capable of reining in protectionism, although now we are witnessing a surge in protectionist measures, and the volume thereof is much ahead of the liberalizing or liberal measures by G20 members. Digital economy and related issues are high on the agenda and have been high on the agenda of late, but the recent summit came with apocalyptic projections that G20 would be as unsuccessful as APEC and OECD and others, but still you have been able to coordinate the final document, to endorse the final document. And indeed, a powerful message was sent to the public, which is good news and gratifying news. And I'd like to ask Svetlana Lukash, who participated in the wording of that final document, and now she has enrolled on the engagement with the Japanese presidency. What are the landmark achievements of the recent period, and what priorities you see in the short and mid-term? Thank you so much, Marina. I'm so glad to welcome all of you. I thank the Academy for hosting all of us today, and we're able on the sidelines of the Gaidar Forum to talk G20. The National Economy Academy, which is RANEPA, is one of the main suppliers of ideas for Russian participation in G20. You said G20 is crisis-stricken, and you said many a person is skeptical about its future, but let's spare a thought. G20 is the only format that brings together the major developed and developing economies, advanced emerging markets. G20 has been able to come to terms on the key issues of global agenda, and some people disagree on those issues. G20 is the only format that is looking into global trends that impact the future development of civilization and the global economy. And we've been looking into digitalization, migration, climate change, and how they impact the global economy, as well as the human capital and human development. What happened in Buenos Aires? We have had a giant leap forward, a breakthrough after several failures at APEC and G7 summits. G20 has been able to agree upon several key things, like we have been able to reduce the acuteness of the trade differences, and we have been able to agree to reform the WTO, which is a breakthrough, allowing us possibly to be able to find in future new ways and means of to aid global growth. And G20 has been analyzing and assessing the future of digitalization of our economy, all that defines our future. What am I driving at? I mean that we should focus on the human being, on how the labor market has been changing, what is happening to the employment formats, what is to happen to the welfare schemes and allowances, and the government sometimes are not aware how the life of common people has been changing. Like we are born to this world, and then we are educated, then we work, and then we retire. But now the paradigm becomes more sophisticated and more complex, bearing in mind the digital capability of the new economic paradigm. In Argentina, we have been able to start discussing the education as a key pillar of this new paradigm and pattern. All the skills that we obtain within this new technology revolution context will help define the competitiveness of each and every nation, and possibly the digital and trade issues will be something that we will keep discussing in the near future. What we may expect in during the Japanese presidency? Well, the human capital focus will persist, and we will talk how we can develop in this new context, the Japanese presidency wants to look into the sustainable economic development, analyze risks that we're fraught with, that the world is fraught with currently, and we will look into and tackle the new trends and challenges that were to a certain extent neglected in the past, like the climate change, demographics, aging, population aging, and how all that has an influence on the global economy. And definitely we will follow up on the digital agenda, including the new risks for financial markets and new risks for healthcare, development and the energy sector. We will have a lot of new procedures in our format to have a better coherence between different items of the agenda. We'll have joint ministerial meetings on trade and digital development and healthcare and finance. We will also look together at energy and climate. Well, probably I would be interested to listen to the wonderful makeup of the panel that we're having today, renowned and prominent people, and probably they will share their ideas how to develop Russian priorities in G20 and go beyond. Thank you, Svetlana. I think that we'll have all that, and we have very many contradictions with respect to whether G20 has been successful in delivering its agenda, but the financial regulation definitely is, without a doubt, a case study, and everybody recognizes that G20 has been successful therein, although the markets analysis is something that G20 puts ahead of everything else. An important aspect of G20 interaction is the social partnerships. Like B20 is one of our key partners. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like C20 and E20 also matter a lot, but B20 is one of the key partners of ours, and I'd like to yield now to Denis Shilakov, first Vice President of Gazprom Bank. Will someone fetch a mic, please? A microphone.
Can you switch on the channel? Can you switch on the channel? Денис Владимирович, извините.
We apologize. We have had some technical issue. Dear colleagues, friends, it's the second time I attend this forum. Thank you for the invitation. One of my colleagues, before I took my seat, asked me whether I have any bearing on G20, but I said I am only Russian national. This is the only bearing, the only link I have. But you know, I spent 10 years serving as Russian diplomat. At that time, G20 didn't exist. Then I served in Barclays Bank in London. But whether there is any link with all that, I recall when Sberbank IPO was on the table and wanted to win the bid at Barclays, and we at that time didn't have the national capabilities, the national characteristics, like the Bears and others and Goldman Sachs. And an Australian colleague asked me, what if we imagine that the world has changed and Sberbank is not a Russian company, but a global national champion? And when we presented and delivered that pitch, they told us, okay, let's take your pitch as our core. Well, we didn't win that bid, but I recall the words of that Australian person about the national champion. What am I driving to? I do capital markets, which is today the battlefield of sanction wars, and Russia has been suffering from that. This slide was made by us to take stock of the well-known challenges and the opportunities on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side, respectively. And these may be some new ideas that may be of help for us. And G20 would be able to find some new foundation for dialogue. These trends are RMB internationalization, new international development institutes emerging like the Brics Bank and AIIB, although these are dollar-denominated institutions. Then we see response and reaction to potential restrictions, and now some people start professing forward-thinking and a forward-thinking attitude, and ruble should be international borrowing currency, as we think. In this red dotted square, with the punctured line, what do we have there? Well, the international capital market is a platform where everybody can borrow, which was the habitual image. But over the past 9 years, something has changed, probably. If we look at emerging markets, I left Barclays in 2012. Starting from 2009, not a single dollar was spent to finance emerging markets in that institution, only refinancing and rescheduling operations. We are seeing now that at the global markets, emerging countries have placed the amounts 2 times as big as before, but at the domestic markets they placed 6 times as much money as before. So they start leaning on their own domestic markets and harnessing those more actively. Why have I said all that? Now it's about the distribution of resources and hedging against risks. G20, well, it used to be G8 in the past, or Brics plus Mexico, which is the other pole. What resource is today the most important one? Population. In the red part of the world, we have 4 times more population. And in developed countries, it costs so dear to bring up a kid. £400,000 after tax to lead a child to university from the infancy. Few people can afford that. So high-skilled labor, high-skilled manpower is one of the key resources nowadays. And in this slide, we see markets, key capital markets. Now we have lots of differences, but there is only one platform leveling all those differences, and everybody is interested staying there and being present there. You can play for different national teams and then play within one and the same football club. Russian, UK, US, China and Japan are in the screen. Their value in dollar equivalent. Our market is 25 times smaller than the Chinese. The Chinese market increased manifold, and the European market increased 2.5 times since the Eurozone was founded. And the Chinese market can only grow taking the shares of other markets. And the concept of a new Silk Road has emerged now. if all the countries along this new Silk Road are taken, that would be similar in size to the Eurozone, and that can be a confrontation-free pattern of development for different countries. And this is our market, domestic capital market in detail. It's the only one of the Brics markets where our national currency is fully convertible. We enjoy the full conversion. We have an international system localized from the capital markets perspective. In the lower, at the bottom, we can see like the 25% in OFZs, which is the curve, the red curve, is the share of foreign investors, international investors' participation in the issuances of the finance ministry bonds. Despite all the political differences, the capital markets are a foundation for us to interact and exchange and engage with each other. If we take Russia and China, these two countries, and we ask ourselves whether the national currency's appearance would be an additional burden to the Western countries competing with the West. But we advocate that first, it's based on international rules and norms, and B, it has enjoyed incremental development. The pace of development is similar. The absolute numbers are different. In Barclays, we supported the first issuance of Russian Federation rubles in 1996. In 2001, the first issuance of Chinese RMB bonds followed. We coincide in our steps on national domestic markets. I mean Russia and China. Although we cannot always penetrate the markets of each other in all the areas. We, the capital market professionals, have been facing these barriers each day. Do you know the exchange rate, the ruble to RMB exchange rate, 7 to 8 or probably 10? How much will that be in 1 year? And the longest forward contract on the Moscow Stock Exchange, it's only 6 days. How can one reckon settlements in national currencies if we only have 6 days forwards? We have the calculations in dollars and euro. So we haven't tapped in that resource at this point of time. The capital markets have a well-established set of rules, which is A, but B, we lack issuances by sovereigns of one country in a national currency of another country. Barring the case of the UK in 2014, they had a RMB issuance, so we'll have to use international platforms. Rushydro, last year, it's not subject to sanctions. They issued Eurobonds in RMB and rubles, similar in value, 2 tranches, 2 offerings. In both of these offerings, Russian international investors participated. This is an exception, so we'll have to use international rules, and this is probably my main conclusion.
For this huge resource to work, we need the rules upon which the trust is built. These rules are functioning through the banking system and through the capital markets. Not that much is required for that, to issue national instruments in mutual markets. If this happens, then the rules will have to be harmonized. If today we use the 13 trillion Chinese market and $500 billion Russian market, well, of course, they're incompatible. But if we manage to tap into it, the potential is going to be huge. The same can be done in almost all the Brics countries and the G20 markets, Russia, Turkey, Russia, India, India, China, all of this can be functioning just as the switch does. As mentioned previously, the capital markets are very tightly disciplined areas. Only openness gives them a chance to work efficiently. But the capital markets allow us to use the international rules, and through contacting one another, they help develop one another. And I think this has to be a part of such a wonderful forum as G20. Thank you very much, Denis Vladimirovich. Svetlana Vladimirovna, I'd like to ask you a question. How promising of a topic that is for the G20, or maybe that is more within the purview of Brics, maybe colleagues from the IMF will also comment on that. Well, to be honest, this issue is already covered by the G20. It should be developed further, no doubt about that, especially amid the current economic environment and the spiraling sanction conflicts, which we are regrettably party to. Thank you very much for this insightful analysis. Yes. Thank you very much. Indeed, the capital markets, financial regulation, these are one of the most important topics for the G20, but of no less importance is another huge chunk of activity, that is ensuring a sustainable, strong, inclusive growth. Yet another time before the G20 summit, the OECD and the IMF warned against an uneven growth. The G20 took some decisions to address this matter, promising to use all the fiscal and monetary instruments in order to ensure a well-balanced and sustainable growth. And yet a lot has been said today about the risks involved in this growth. At the first session, there was a question asked of the panelists. So could you comment on that? Once again, what the major risks are? I would like to give the floor to Martin Gellman. I'd like to ask him to talk a little bit about these risks, whether the G20 is capable of addressing them. And after that, I'd like to give the floor to Gabriele Dubello to tell us what options are available in our collective policies and national policies in order to overcome the risks we are seeing. Martin, shall we start with you?
I'll continue in English. I'll let Gabrielle talk about policies and possible solutions. I'll just address really the question of the risk to the international financial and economic system. Does this work? Yes. Sorry. Okay. So just to say, before giving the floor to Gabrielle to talk about the policy solutions, let me emphasize the question of risk. I noticed that in Denis's excellent presentation, he was talking about opportunities, but not necessarily the risk. And my basic point here, as a former senior official of the IMF, is that 10 years ago, after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy and the beginning of the great financial crisis, there was an opportunity where the G10 might have, had there been sufficient political will, to really change the international financial system. That didn't happen, okay? And now we have a situation where, because of, as Denis's slides show, the enormous expansion of international debt, especially public debt, that in large part has substituted for private liabilities. So the taxpayers have now taken on greater burdens. We now face a situation where we are highly leveraged. In fact, the global debt levels are now, as Denis's slides show, the global debt level is now higher than it was at the time of the at the beginning of the last crisis. Okay? And also I liked the slides because they also showed that they obviously didn't produce a lot of new assets because the asset values are actually did not go up nearly as much as the debt. And all of the academic studies have shown that, in fact, it takes more and more of a dollar of debt to produce a dollar of GDP growth. And that's not just in the United States or in European countries. It's true everywhere. And a blatant example of that is China. And so I think that what I would like to emphasize really is that we have a enormous debt overhang that, according to IMF figures, global debt is now 60% higher than at the time of the global financial crisis in 2008. And I would emphasize the fact that you've also got a tremendous expansion of debt in dollars by non-dollar currency countries. Again, according to IMF numbers, in preparation for the Buenos Aires summit, there was $3.7 trillion of dollar-denominated loans to non-dollar emerging market economies that have to be paid back. Their interest rates in dollars have gone up, and the ability to refinance that may be in jeopardy, could be in jeopardy. Now, what I'm outlining here is simply the fact that there are risks out there that, if everything goes well, will not happen. But as they sometimes say in the markets, it's priced to perfection. If everything doesn't go well, there could be a huge meltdown. And this could be not only because of the dollar debt of non-dollar currency countries, but it could also be, say, the balance sheet or off-balance sheet liabilities in terms of corporate debt in Western Europe, China, and the United States. We don't know where it could happen. And if I were a follower of William White, who was the former chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, White has said that we should really be thinking of the global economic system not as some type of DGSE model that we can plug in the determinants and come out with a likely scenario, but we should think of it almost like earthquake science or fractals, that we don't know really what could happen. But the likelihood that we are now in, say, the United States, 10 years beyond the last recession, which means that the recovery, slow as it has been since the great financial crisis, has been gradual and slow and not robust. But it does make one think that how long can this continue, particularly because you've got a United States government which has questionable economic management. You've got a huge proliferation of treasury liabilities in the United States that has to be paid for. And therefore, there are many factors here that could connote real risk. So my question to the G20, and I appreciate what Svetlana was saying coming out of Buenos Aires and going into the Japanese chair, is, we should talk about, climate change and demographic issues, etc. There are a lot of long-term issues that are critically important to humanity. However, the last set of issues that she mentioned, that is, what are the financial risks, are, in my view, paramount. And between now and the next time this forum meets, there could be an urgent situation if we're not careful. And so I would say that in my view, the main task of the G20, but I don't know how they would do it, is what I would call damage control. because there are serious risks that there could be a major financial meltdown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that the last two times we met, Martin also was very emphatic about this risk, and it is still there. And obviously, the G20 has still not done anything about that. So the question is, what, if there are any policy options G20 can use to prevent the crisis or to manage the damage? Okay.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's very good to be here. I'm going to be very general. I'm going to say some things that we have been already as an institution for some time, and what we have actually covered in the last G20 meeting in Buenos Aires is very aligned to what the institution has said in our flagship presentation, that is a publication, that is the World Economic Outlook. By the way, this World Economic Outlook is going to be updated pretty soon. In the next few days, we are going to have that update, just with our view of the global economy. But the first thing that I think that is important to realize is that economic cycles are part of economic reality. And I remember early in the 2000s when people were talking about the end of the economic cycle, and then the global financial crisis happened. I think that I'm going not necessarily completely disagree with Martin, but I think that many things have been done in great part because of the efforts of a group of countries in the G20, but also in other multilateral fora. I think that the main lesson, of course, is that during good times, authorities and economies alike need to control and curb the imbalances that grow, and also be prepared, build buffers, and put policies in place to be prepared for bad times, and in particular to protect those that would be most affected by downturns, but also to allow the economies to react fast to downturns and to resume growth also fast. One thing that we have been saying, in particular in the last World Economic Outlook, and this is in line with what Martin was saying, is that we know that risks have increased, in particular in the last 6 months. There are multiplicity of risks, and many of these risks actually feed with each other. And we note that not only in the medium term, but in the short term, these risks are tilted to the downside now. Still, growth continues to be pretty solid. I mean, the world economy is growing more than 3.5% per year, and has been the case for the last 2 years. In terms of policy recommendations, that is specifically the question. We have tailored our policy recommendation depending on what type of countries we are talking into. I mean, we have a global membership, and so we tailor our recommendations depending on degree of development of countries. And for advanced economies, what we are saying is that policies need to be tailored depending on whether there is still room or not in their cyclical positions. So when inflation is close or above the target, basically monetary policy needs to continue to be supportive, but when inflation is below target, basically when inflation is above target, monetary policy needs to begin tighten gradually. Most importantly, what we have been saying already for some time is that countries need to use, as I was saying before, this period of sustained and in some cases above trend growth to build buffers, to recover fiscal space, to curb the increase in debt, and also use this opportunity to begin making investments in digital and real infrastructure to increase growth. With respect to emerging market and low-income countries, the situation is much more diverse. And there, I think that both groups of countries need to prepare for the consequences of regular tightening in global financial conditions. And what we see is that the market is actually rewarding those economies that apply better policies. Of course, in emerging markets in low-income countries, the task of governments to protect the more vulnerable is more important. One thing that goes to the core of the G20 is that multilateralism is under increased question, and a forum like G20 is a response to those questions to multilateralism. Many of the problems that the world faces right now, has been facing for some time, require multilateral responses, multilateral answers, and G20 is at the forefront of that. Just to finalize, I would say that there are a number of issues that require immediate attention. There are some positive signs coming from the final statement in Buenos Aires. Overall and paramount are the trade tensions. Basically, the response to trade tensions should be not necessarily increasing barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers, should be dialogue. Problems of migration need also a multilateral response, multilateral answer. With respect to a global financial system, I would disagree with Martin. Lots have been done, and I think one of the issues, and doesn't mean that there is not more to be done, but lots has been done, and one of the pressures and one of the risks is to reverse many of the things that have been done, so that those pressures need to be avoided. And finally, I'd say that cross-border cooperation is also key to resolving when there are excess imbalances in different countries, to tackle tax avoidance and for mitigating greenhouse emissions and climate change. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. You touched in your intervention on the issues of trade tensions already. And yes, this is one of the major problems and risks of trade tensions, and their impact on growth are really very high. Наталья, я хочу попросить вас сказать.
I would like to ask you, Natalia, to say a couple of words about how you assess the risks with which trade protectionism is fraught with regard to economic growth. Could you give us the remote, please? Good afternoon. This is a very important topic in the context of Russia and the world as a whole. Svetlana, in her first intervention, credited the Buenos Aires summit with a breakthrough in reforming the trade system, the global system. I think it was high time this were done. It comes too late even now. We should have done it a long time ago. And to support that, I'll show you some data on protectionism over the last 2 decades within the context of the G20. Just a couple of words about the role of the world trade. Well, I think it wouldn't do any good if I talk about how important trade is for the economic development over the last 2.5 centuries. We've seen some changes in the trade. New drivers have emerged. We have seen new phenomena translating trade into economic growth, but we understand that you cannot be prosperous on your own without the markets, without communicating in isolation. Over the last 6 decades, trade has been the driver for the economic growth, both for advanced and developing economies. The mechanisms can be different, the conditions can vary, and yet through specialization, through market access, through economy of scales, because you can purchase and sell at foreign markets at a lower price, thanks to competition, and that is a driver for innovation, thanks to transfer of technologies, thanks to all of these factors, we have seen how all of this has been important in translating the benefits of trade into economic growth. Yes, experts understand well how trade impacts growth, but over the last decade, since the global financial crisis, we have seen something interesting happened, something unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. For several years, 8 or 9 years, trade was growing at a lower pace than the world GDP. The blue line is the growth of trade, whereas the red line is the GDP growth. And as you can see, there were 2 times before the crisis when trade plummeted and was lower than the GDP growth. It is very sensitive to crisis, but it recovers just as quickly. So there were just sporadic movements of trade. But on a systemic basis, over the last 6 years, trade has been growing at a lower pace than the world GDP. And we've seen that under the G20. Certainly, the G20 is not to blame for that. But this is a factor that has to be understood. So far, we cannot give a definitive answer, even though we've got some hypotheses. One of important factors that have impacted this trend is the surge of protectionism. This graph shows the dynamics, the number of protectionist measures in red and liberalization measures in green. The measures taken by the G20 since 2008. Global Trade Alert was established back in 2008 in real time. It tracks these measures employed by different countries against other countries. A surge in protectionist measures. And protectionist measures are measures that seeks to improve the standing of national companies against that of foreign companies. And we've seen this surge since 2012 among the G20 countries. This couldn't but have impacted the world trade growth rate that has become lower than that of the world GDP. This graph is an assessment of the measures accumulated since 2008. 2018 is in brown, because we call 2018 the year when trade was erupted, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. Protectionism had been accumulating gradually, and the countries that turned out to be the most protectionist in 2018 had been doing the same thing before. You can see the US is ahead, Germany lags behind. In 2018, Russia has also taken several measures, but as you can see, the number of accumulated inefficient protectionist measures runs very high. And this also translates into slower growth rate for the world trade as compared to the world GDP growth or the world output growth. This has an impact upon the G20 countries. As you can see, this table shows the share of G20 countries' exports that is covered by the protectionist measures introduced by the G20 countries. Say, in 2009, just 30% of the Argentinian export was covered by protectionist measures, whereas in 2018 it's 74%. We can see the same trend across all the countries. It has a distorting effect upon the volume of export, and this also contributes to the bad dynamics of trade, which we saw at the very outset of my presentation. This also has an impact upon non-G20 members. Yes, the G20 countries are hit the hardest, but Latin American countries, Asian countries that are not part of the G20 are also hit by these protectionist measures. Their prospects in trade and economic growth become worse. As for the world GDP, autumn last year, the IMF presented some model calculations on how the protectionism impacted the world GDP. 4 scenarios were presented for mid and short-term effects. There was a case on the US when tariffs on aluminium were slapped against China, whereas metal tariffs were slapped on other countries as well. I refer to the 10% tariff in blue. Since 2019, the US intends to slap a 25% tariff worth 267 billion of imports from China. That's in red. The yellow line is automobiles and spare parts for the automobiles. Should this decision come into force, a 25% tariff is going to be slapped on these goods. And as you can see, the growth rate is going to plummet. The US stands to lose up to 1% of the GDP. China is also going to lose. The world is going to lose 0.5 percentage points of the GDP. But what's curious is the following. The IMF sees a greater uncertainty and greater mistrust among countries. And radical changes that are right now possible in trade make investors more cautious. Some investment plans are revised. This impacts economic growth. And this echoes with what Martin has said. There is an issue with financial markets because they respond to this uncertainty. And corporations have a smaller maneuver for financial operations, for getting loans. And the gray line is just that, worse financial conditions for corporations. Developing countries are going to be hit harder because access to finance is very important for the corporations and companies of these countries. Yes, the developed countries' companies can stay afloat thanks to the access to their national resources, whereas developing countries need access to foreign markets. If the worst scenarios materialize, the world GDP is going to lose 1%, and in the long run, it can be up to 0.5% every year. As you can see, the protectionism is very expensive. It's very costly. The ECB has produced its own calculations, which echo with the results obtained by the IMF. The ECB emphasizes that there is a cost involved in greater uncertainty and high prices. These are the key elements that are going to transmit the protectionist effect on other markets, both developed and developing countries. The countries that employ protectionist measures are going to be hit hardest, but the growth of others is also going to slow down. In what way the G20 is responsible for the surge of protectionism is questionable. It is hard to blame the G20 for anything, but I do not think the G20 has done enough to curb the surge of protectionism when it first started. My hypothesis is as follows. The surge of protectionism, especially with regard to financial institutions in 2008 and 2009, well, that surge simply slipped over to the real economy. And the countries that in the past didn't contemplate protectionist measures all of a sudden saw that it was possible to resort to such measures. Unfortunately, the crisis the WTO has been gripped by over the last 20 years has prevented it from preventing this slipover of paternalism and protectionism from the financial sector to the real economy. As of now, it is impossible not to demand that the G20 should do something, should take a position on the WTO reform. The WTO, and we have to understand it, cannot reform itself, unlike many other organizations, it is very difficult to achieve an internal reform. There is no procedure for the WTO mechanism because the WTO is nothing but an envelope, whereas the actors are the countries that are members of the WTO. So it is up to the countries to achieve an agreement in order to shape the agenda for the reform and shape the reform itself.
And major WTO countries should be brought up and constitute a platform to come to terms and reform WTO. No other mechanism is probably possible but for G20. And within the Japanese presidency, the think tank group of G20 are now trying to come up with 4 policy briefs for further implementation. And that has to do with the WTO reform, reinvigorating the WTO as a negotiating platform, reinforcing the WTO as the dispute settlement procedure, strengthening and improving the world trading system, and promoting sustainable and inclusive growth. Thank you, Natalia. Indeed, it has been an exhaustive presentation, including the expectations that E20 would be able to make valuable proposals to G20. Well, still G20 has not been able to contain protectionism. It was kind of rebuke. It has been kind of rebuke. So, Marat, do you think that those high expectations with respect to what G20 can offer to WTO are plausible, and whether you think it will receive some follow-up? Thank you. I would like to thank Natalia Volochkova for a detailed and compelling presentation. The topic that we're raising today is quite relevant, and the general public and the media judge whether this or that format is viable, building on whether this or that format is capable of resolve trade disputes and defeat protectionism that is now raising its head and is coming to a new scale, bigger scale. We all know why this response, why this stance. We recall times of the Great Depression when protectionism came to a head. But what is happening today is happening because of the objective reasons. We are seeing a redistribution and global shifts in the economy. And many countries are trying to protect themselves. And the economy itself and the architecture of global trade are undergoing a transformation. When we're trying to assess the efficiency of different institutions or formats, we should first recall that these are not individual stakeholders, but these are platforms bringing different stakeholders together. And it takes the political will of all the stakeholders, of all the member states, all the participants, to get to grips with the crisis manifestations. And we should look at the set of characteristics of each and every institution. Like G20 is unique in several ways. It combines major economies, the top 20 economies. It's headed by the global leaders, so the the power of the decision-making by G20 is huge. And these decisions are perceived as legitimate. Definitely, it is still a limited format, but many people believe it is a format enjoying high representation and a broad geographic scope, putting together various economies from all over the world. And G20 is able today to come to terms and find ways out at a time when different fora cannot agree upon anything. In Argentina, made another important step forward. Like starting from 2010, G20 has been contributing to curtailing protectionism, restraining protectionism. G20 has its merit in stopping the protectionism from acquiring a bigger, uncontrolled scale, veering out of control. And we're seeing that the projections for the next year are becoming more moderate, and some of the economies are curbing their protectionist measures, like China. When someone wants to come to terms and develop trade ties, they manifest their will. Like the trade between Russia and China will surpass $100 billion next year, probably. In Buenos Aires, we didn't say that we condemn protectionism. We had done that before on many occasions. But we kick-started some of the developments to reform, some of the steps to reform the WTO and make a change in the current trade context. And in Osaka, shortly, we will take stock of the progress made in the forthcoming half a year, and we'll be able to present some interim results to the global community. Thank you. This is what we are looking forward. And it can become a major achievement since 2009, since the first G20 summits, when real tangible decisions were made to curb protectionism. Another important area of G20 activities that was high on the agenda in Buenos Aires is the SDG implementation and the high-quality infrastructures. We keep emphasizing that there are different expert assessments about the level of investments in critical infrastructures. It's insufficient as of today, and G20 has been struggling to coordinate investments with the help of the multilateral development banks, and a new report came out by some prominent G20 experts, financing for development, and the World Bank contributed a lot there too. They participated in consultations quite actively, and some experts believe that the multilateral banks system is not fully operational. It could be much more efficient in providing high-quality infrastructure investments. Whether it's true or not, justified or not, Andrzej, can you comment upon that? What is the World Bank perspective?
Thank you very much. Of course, it's true, but I will be more detailed in my response. I want to give, first, I really appreciate your stamina staying with us so late. It's quite remarkable, so I hope we live up to your expectations. But I would like to give a little bit of context to this question. So When we look at the overall system of development, we need to acknowledge the progress that has been made in the past few decades. So if you look at poverty in 1990 and you look at today, there were more than a billion people, 100 million people moving out of poverty in that period. And if you compare 1970 to today, in 1970 poverty was 30%, extreme poverty was 30% in the world, and today it's about 10%. It's still high. It's about 770 million people, half of them in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's a huge progress. But there are also, of course, very significant challenges. If you look at schooling, for example, you have 250 million kids who are not in school. You have another 250 million students who actually are illiterate. They are in school, but they cannot read. Half of the world population does not have access to healthcare. So there are these huge development problems that are still there. There are some global issues. You have 2 billion people living in countries which are affected by conflict or fragility. You have climate change. You have all those issues which we call global public goods that need to be addressed. So you referred to this report by the Eminent Persons Group, which is a background document for the G20 meeting. Some of these eminent persons actually are on the corridors of this conference. I met two of them this morning. And it's a very good report. It clearly sets out some of the key issues for the multilateral development system. And let me just summarize the recommendations. And they're not particularly new. I think they are reinforcing some of the ideas earlier made. And the reason why they are doing that is that they claim urgency, and urgency because of things have changed. One is that this is a multipolar world system, which is different from what it was 2 decades ago. There are new players in the field. There are new development banks that have emerged, and the emergence of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the NDB took place after a hiatus of 25 years. I mean, the last development bank was the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development that was created after the changes in Eastern Europe. So it is a multipolar world, which we all agree is a good thing, but it also comes with new challenges. It's also, there are new challenges that some of you already referred to, whether it's the digital divide or the changing nature of work. So there are a lot of those things that beyond the development challenges that we have seen in the past decades that require a review. So the main recommendations include focus more. This is focus you, development banks, and those who partner with you on supporting countries to improve their governance and increase human capital. Work more to close the infrastructure gap, and this is the point that I will come back to, by mobilizing private sector financing, address public goods together, and make the system work as a system. So there is an imperative to us to do better in coordination. So what are the issues in the system? Okay, on the face of it, you have a system in place. So you have the SDGs that provide sort of the framework, the main goals for development for the world. You have coordination mechanism. You have the G20. You have the Development Committee, which contains representatives of the other 170 countries. I mean, we have a membership between the IMF and the World Bank. The membership is close to 190. So the G20 is very large in terms of the overall strengths of the world, in the role of the world economy. But there are other countries, of course, with important interest. Then there are coordination meetings among MDBs and so on. And then you have the country-level coordination systems in place. So on the face of it, you have all these things there. But then the question is why people feel that this is not working well enough. And I think there are answers to that. So, the World Bank is the only institution which has 189 members. The other members of the system, they have a smaller membership with a particular focus. So you have 60, 70 members in regional development banks. You have 5 members in a fairly large development bank, the new development bank. So the interests differ. And when you come to points like the use of country platform, I mean, the ideal situation in development is that it's driven by the country, it's not driven by donors. And the idea is that you have a country which has capacity to develop its own development plan, and the international community comes to support that rather than dictating the terms or dictating the objectives. And so there are different views. I mean, in principle, everybody subscribes to this, but when you look at in reality to what extent development institutions actually follow that country platform, there are differences. And when you are a practitioner and you go to a meeting in a developing country where donors are together, you find a lot of different interests, where they want to engage, how they want to engage, and so on. So we came up with solutions for that. There were sector-based approaches. There are programs for results in the World Bank. They're supposed to bring different institutions together to finance one program by the government. But there are also differing views on the use of country systems. This is one of the most debated issue. Some people would like to accept whatever procurement financial management systems a country has, or what kind of environmental or social standards they have. But there is no agreement in the international community around those standards. I mean, we just, our institution just approved a set of standards for environmental and social safeguards when we finance projects in countries, but those standards are not endorsed by other institutions. So there are countries that are on the receiving end who have to meet different standards by different institutions. And that's precisely what I think the eminent persons are suggesting that we don't do. And then there's the whole question of the global public good. So that's a very difficult one, and we are trying to balance it. Because the basic system, especially for institutions that are lending, and the MDBs are lending, whether it's on concessional terms or semi-concessional terms, most of the funds are on loan terms. So, and they go to countries. So addressing global public goods where the benefits are asymmetrical, and then doing business on a country basis, where countries may or may not want to borrow for climate change mitigation, for example, maybe for adaptation, is non-trivial. So we have to square this circle working in a way that countries benefit from this assistance, but also there are externalities and benefits there. So let me, after a long introduction, come back to the infrastructure point. So there are different estimates of the infrastructure financing gap. They vary from $1 billion a year to something like 5.5 billion to 2035. But the point is that that gap is large, and that gap cannot be and should not be filled by public sector funding. It cannot be filled because the total capacity of the MDB system is maybe, 130 billion a year, so that's not a possibility. So the need is to mobilize the private financing. So if you look at the narrative, you hear that we have to go from billions to trillions, and there are $80 trillion of assets managed by institutional investors, and they are providing low return to most of these assets. So there's a good case to be made how to bring some of these private sector savings into infrastructure assets in developing countries, and that's precisely the suggestion from the eminent persons group, and what we have taken as an initiative in the World Bank, what is called mobilizing finance for development, is establishing that platform where we try to bring together public resources with private financing by creating standard provisions, standard contracts, and trying to create an asset class of infrastructure assets that could be then purchased by institutional investors and other private sector participants. I mean, it's not that we haven't done anything. It's, in 2017, there was about $160 billion of private sector financing mobilization. So, in fact, there was a leverage which is more than one for public sector contributions. But it's going to be a big challenge. I'm not underestimating this. This is not the first time we try to do that, but I think there is the political backing to make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Story, and I remember that in 2013 it was one of the priorities of the Russian presidency in G20. Одна из более поздних тем, но очень важная.
One of the later topics in G20 agenda is the digital economy and digital infrastructure development, and how G20 wants, on the one hand, to overcome the widening digital gap or divide and use the new tech and state-of-the-art technology and the new economy for the sake of more inclusive growth. Well, the agenda is fledgling, and Zia, what do you think? Can G20 contribute a lot to overcome this growing digital gap or divide?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. In the time that I have, I'll make 3 points. First, there is useful but insufficient progress by the G20 in addressing the digital economy. Yes, some steps have been taken under recent G20 presidencies in addressing elements of the digital economy agenda. Most recently, under the Argentinian presidency, 3 areas were identified as initial focus areas: the digital infrastructure, digital government, and measuring the digital economy. Aspects of the changing future of work were also addressed to some extent. This is a good start, but the approach has been incremental and piecemeal. And there is a need to take on the digital economy agenda in a bolder, deeper, and broader way. Technological changes that are underway today are perhaps unparalleled in terms of their scope, scale, and speed, ranging from more increasingly sophisticated computer systems, mobile telephony, digital platforms, robotics, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, artificial superintelligence, and emerging Internet of Things. And the impact of these technologies, they are not limited to certain issues or segments of the economy. They're economy-wide, and they're universal. They are global. The change permeates all markets, product markets, spanning production and commerce, labor markets and the nature of work, financial markets, and the markets for increasingly important intangible assets of knowledge and intellectual property. And at the international level, digital globalization is ushering in a new era of global flows with the rise of digital trade and global technology giants. Cross-border digital flows today are estimated to have a larger impact on global growth than traditional flows of traded goods. So reflecting this, the main theme of the World Economic Forum in Davos next week is what they call the Fourth Industrial Revolution, led by digital technologies, and what they call the related Globalization 4.0 agenda. In announcing these themes for the coming World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, who is the man behind World Economic Forum, stated that the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 have only just begun. But we are already vastly unprepared for that. And I think that's an apt observation. So that's my first point on the issue and where we are. And my second point is that policies have a key role to play, but policy responses have been behind the curve. The digital technologies have enormous potential, considerable promise, to boost economic progress and raise human welfare. But technological change is inherently disruptive. The gains from today's technological advancement are not automatic. Their realization depends crucially on policy responses. And what do we see? Paradoxically, as these technologies boomed in recent years, productivity growth, which is the main driver of long-term economic growth, slowed rather than accelerated. The benefits of the new technologies were in large part captured by a relatively small number of big firms. Market concentration, monopoly power, monopoly rents increased, productivity stagnated for the vast majority of other firms. And at the same time, workers faced job and wage losses as the new technologies favored capital and shifted demand from low and middle level skills to higher level skills. So the result of these developments has been that long-term economic growth slowed and income and wealth inequalities increased, fueling societal discontent, political backlash, and the rise of populism that we see in the world today. And the recent US experience vividly illustrates this. Over the past decade plus, average labor productivity growth in the United States has been lower than half of what it was in the previous decade plus. And over roughly the same period, income inequality in the US, as measured, for example, by the income share of the richest 1%, more than doubled. A major reason for these adverse growth and distributional outcomes is that policies have been slow to adapt as the new technologies reshape markets and the nature of work. And that leads me to my third and final point, framing the way forward. The upshot of what I just summarized is that the digital technologies are profoundly altering the dynamics of economic growth, jobs, and income distribution. And it is this framing that the G20 could use in approaching the digital economy agenda, not in a piecemeal way of a couple of discrete issues at a time, but through the integrated, holistic lens of growth, jobs, and distribution. Framing the core forward agenda in terms of how to better harness the potential of the new technologies to achieve more robust growth and more inclusive growth. So within such an integrated framework, you then see what are the key areas for policy consideration and action. For example, revitalizing competition for the digital age, improving the innovation ecosystem, R&D policies, intellectual property rights, to promote wider diffusion of innovations, boosting investment in upskilling, reskilling workers, lifelong learning, reforming labor market policies and social protection systems because social contracts need to be overhauled. There are new challenges in tax systems as the digital economy, intangible economy expands. And at the international level, there is need for new disciplines for digital globalization. This is a large agenda. The G20 can contribute to this in three ways. Through knowledge sharing on the new issues and policy innovations, through coordinated policy efforts, and three, where appropriate, through common collective actions. And within the G20, the Framework Working Group, this is one of the core working groups in G20, whose mandate focuses on strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. That working group can take the lead in taking this work forward. It can help anchor and integrate within a framework of growth, jobs, and distribution the work on digital economy issues by the more specialized G20 work streams with expert support provided as needed by international institutions. The G20, of course, does not have to do all of this work itself. It can provide strategic leadership, political leadership, and a coherent framework, and work with competent international institutions based on their respective mandates to substantively move this agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a comprehensive and very ambitious agenda, and probably to a certain extent coupled, of course, with the imminent risks of debt and overhang in the debt. This could probably provide a platform for reinvention of G20 and resolving its identity crisis, which some of the experts think it is experiencing now, at least at the leaders' level.
My point is, growth is already at the core of G20 agenda, the framework working group. So the point is that the new digital economy agenda should be integrated with that growth agenda, stronger growth, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, related issue of jobs. So if you look at it this way, then it is not something extraneous that you pick one issue here, one issue there. It should be integrated with the growth agenda. That's where it belongs.
True. В двадцатке, как Светлана...
As Svetlana said, from the very beginning, the G20 brings together both the developed countries and the developing countries, the Brics countries, the G7, and many issues, many priorities that are on the G20 agenda are also part of the Brics agenda, the 5 countries. Next year, Russia is going to once again chair the Brics summit. From the very outset, the Brics supported the G20 agenda, especially in terms of the international financial institutions reform and financial regulation, the infrastructure agenda, and investment into infrastructure. Recently, the digital agenda has been brought to the forefront in Brics. And today, we are privileged in that one of the participants of our discussion, Mr. Tavarayev, is with us. He is Russia's coordinator for the expert group of the Brics Association. I would like to ask you a question. How necessary is it to coordinate the actions of the Brics countries and the G20 countries? Maybe the current system is sufficient and no change is required. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. This is a very interesting session which is dedicated to the G20. But frankly, the Brics Association has a somewhat different nature. Yes, there are some commonalities. The G20 and the Brics Association were established in response to the world financial crisis back in 2007, 2008. They were set up in order to find the best possible response by the countries to the changed circumstances, to the crisis. And these countries, the Brics countries, countries on the ascendant, managed to pull their efforts together in order to fend for their specific interests. From the outset, the Brics Association didn't so much try to get back to the previous system. It mostly sought to effect a change in the global governance system. It wanted to improve and reinforce the role of emerging markets in that very governance system. Right now, 10 years has passed since the inception of BRICS. The goal has changed as well as the circumstances. Some go even as far as to say, as to question the very existence of a world governance system. Some say that it has fallen victim to the destructive policies pursued by President Trump. Last year, India hosted a big conference, Rasina Dialogue, and its theme was very symbolic, a world reorder, so a new world order to emerge. And by many, BRICS was perceived as a revisionist power trying to change this very world order. And the main avenue to this change was, according to the experts, to raise the stake of emerging markets and financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, first and foremost. Next, to get a real influence in the WTO to promote their own agenda in sustainable development and the digital economy and cyber security too. So, just as in the past, BRICS is more a political project, not an economic one. Within the Foreign Ministry, it is the Economic Development Department that is responsible for the G20, whereas BRICS is within the remit of the Foreign Policy Planning Department. Has BRICS achieved its goals over the last decade? On the one hand, we have seen a rise of a very comprehensive structure for the communication of these 5 countries that account for the 27% of the world GDP, something unseen before. These countries have set up more than 100 channels for cooperation between agencies, ministries, people-to-people contacts, civil society contacts. Right now, Russia is getting ready to take the baton and the BRICS chairmanship. It is already planning more than 100 events at different levels and in different formats, and this is a huge advantage. Did the BRICS countries manage to reinforce their standing and global governance? My response to that question is quite a pessimistic one. There were 2 possible paths, 2 avenues pursued by BRICS countries. First, to raise the stake in the existing world order, world governance. I refer to the universal organizations such as the UN, to specialized organizations. And in that regard, BRICS has only achieved very limited results. Yes, indeed, it has managed to bring up its quota level in the IMF to 14.5%, yet that still does not represent adequately BRICS' its position in the world GDP based on PPP. And as a matter of fact, BRICS has failed to transition from the group of rule takers to the rule makers. Right now, in the West, the buzzword is a rule-based order, something the BRICS countries are called upon to stick to. But the countries understand that they were not the ones to have adopted these rules, and these rules are not playing into their favor, but so far they are not capable of doing anything against that. Right now, it is the hegemonic power that revises the world order and not the revisionist powers like Brics. It is the US that erodes the current world governance system. And this is not just because of Trump. It is also something that reflects the objective reality. And amid these conditions, China is advocating the maintenance of the current system, of the current rules. It defends it most vocally. So far, Brics is unable to put anything against the surge of protectionism, even though it is precisely Brics countries that are on the receiving end. They are suffering because of this surge of protectionism. Nor are these countries able to propose anything to improve the situation. The second avenue Brics was pursuing was establishing parallel structures, mirror structures of governance. The only thing they can pride themselves on is the new development bank, the Brics Bank. They did attempt to set up their own energy research platform, another structure in the world information structure and security. But even the NDB example shows us that it follows the rules, the same terms as any other international commercial bank. The only thing different is that its political priorities are set forth by the countries. In other words, it mostly invests in those projects that are not interesting to commercial banks. And I have an impression that were it not for direct orders, NDB would far more pleasantly look into other projects, not the ones it is currently involved in. The other structures set up by the Brics countries are not efficient either so far. A question begs itself. What the prospects of Brics are? Can Brics become a revolutionary element in revisiting the current world governance mechanisms? As far as the G20 is concerned, it is perceived as consisting of two cores. The G7 countries, many other developing and developed countries associate themselves with, and the Brics core. But as a matter of fact, it is far more complicated than that, because countries look after their own interests. And recently, I have to say that even within Brics, we've seen a certain recrudescence of controversies of political nature, as between China and India, of trade and financial nature. A fresh example is China's refusal to use yuan and ruble in mutual settlements, even though that would seem to be one of the priorities for the activities Brics is involved in. Three scenarios can be put forward. The first one is a potential decline of Brics, when Brics turns into nothing more than a photo opportunity, an opportunity to make political statements and adopt declarations to talk about some relevant issues of today. But I think this scenario is not that possible, not that probable, just 10 to 15%. Another scenario that can materialize itself is the Brics consolidation when it is institutionalized, turning into some kind of an international organization, so that it can help it take cohesive actions in the UN reform and in the matter of the WTO reform. I would very much like to put my confidence into this scenario. I think the probability is 20% or so. But in order to pursue this avenue, a lot of obstacles have to be overcome. And very often, it all depends on the political circumstances. The current president of Brazil is somewhat of a riddle how it is going to act with regard to this organization is a question. Well, yes, the summit is going to take place, but how far the countries will manage to go forward is not yet certain. And the third scenario is the Brics stagnation. The West still sees Brics as a geopolitical rival, and it can evolve very slowly in order to fit into the global governance system that is going to emerge in the coming years or decades. And what of its potential role? So far, it is unclear. I believe the third scenario is the most probable one. It's the remaining 60%. And I have to say that Brics will continue to be an efficient issue to respond to acute burning issues such as the fight against protectionism, the fourth digital revolution, international information security, managing common spaces, humanitarian exchanges, anti-civilizational communication, and so on and so forth. What will its relationship look like with the G20? I think this is not that relevant. These are still independent organizations, and that is the impression that I have of our today's discussions. Thank you very much. I would very much like to hope that the optimistic scenario that you have said is not that probable among the three ones you have presented will still have a chance, and I do hope that the Russian chairmanship in Brics is going to make a contribution of its own to help us move along this path. I would like to say that we've had great statements, great interventions today. I would like to express my gratitude to all the speakers. I believe a great many ideas have been proposed for the G20 cooperation. What do you think, Svetlana? I would also like to say thank you to those listeners who've stayed with us until the very end. Indeed, we started very late, but the quality of this discussion was very high, and I do hope it has managed to offset the shifts in our schedule. A huge thank you to everyone, to Svetlana, Andrzej, Gabriel, Zia, Natalia, Denis, Vladimirovich, and I would also like to thank the audience. Thank you.